The skills shortages still remain a real challenge here in WA. Unemployment rate is expected to be 3.75 and they're projecting 4% and 4.25 and 4.5 for the coming years. Net exports of goods and services has accounted for 49% of our gross state product in 22-23. Consumer confidence is often a little bit, but overall pretty upbeat.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here's your host, Jared Mann.
G'day and welcome to another episode of Perth Property Insider. I'm your host, Jared Mann, and today I'm taking a deep dive on WA's economic health, because obviously it's so critical that the economy goes well, because that flows through to people wanting to move here, population growth, pressure on prices, which lead to rental price increases and sale price increases. And if we're an investor and we've got property, I guess that's what we want. At least we want upward pressure on those things. And one of the other key aspects of a strong economy is if wages are increasing, people have the ability to afford to pay more. And so in this episode, I'm going to be going through some of the insights from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry WA, looking at business confidence, consumer confidence, and regional business confidence. So some interesting things to pull out through there. I'm going to touch on inflation and have a little bit of a deeper dive on the WA side numbers that have just been released. And the state has also released its latest economic forecast, which will be interesting to cover off as well. And finally, I'm going to go into what's the makeup of WA's economy and international trade. And I've got some really interesting insights as to what countries we mainly trade with and what is our main sort of trade and services. So it's going to be an interesting episode. Let's jump into it, shall we? When I look at business confidence levels as reported by CCI WA, Chamber of Commerce, shorter term confidence has slightly weakened over the June quarter. And that's mainly come about because of cost pressures led by rising wages, skyrocketing insurance premiums and taxes. So business confidence has taken a little bit of a turn down, and the labour market has started easing a little bit, making it slightly easier to recruit employees, but the skills shortages still remain a real challenge here in WA. So 65% of businesses have reported that it's a barrier to business growth at the moment, finding the right people. And this is the lowest proportion since they began tracking this and asking the question back in September 2021. So things have eased a little bit, but adding to the labour market constraints, there's a limited housing supply, as we know. I mean, I'm always talking about the supply of housing and how tight it is here in Perth. But this has apparently impacted 41% of businesses in their attempts to actually attract staff. So we don't always look at the other side of how the housing market works interchangeably on the attractiveness of people to come here. And when it's hard to rent and hard to sell, that makes it hard for businesses to find employees and to grow. So it all becomes very constrained, and a big bottleneck happens with housing being so tight. So despite the slip in confidence for this quarter, it's important to mention that the state has now recorded 16 consecutive quarters of above average short-term business confidence. So it stands in a stark contrast to the lagging confidence across the rest of the nation, and once again reaffirms that WA's position as Australia's economic powerhouse. So that's sort of quoting directly from this business confidence survey. So very encouraging to see there that while we've had shorter term, slight dip in business confidence compared to the rest of Australia, we're, leading the nation and definitely the economic powerhouse. So, but it is critical that the state keeps sustaining confidence, especially given the longer term outlook is a bit more downbeat. So now, what did the Chamber of Commerce have to say from recent surveys of consumer confidence? It did weaken over the June quarter slightly, and that was also because of cost pressures of household costs, insurance costs, and taxes. Some tax relief there, but no one feels good in the June quarter when you're having to pay your taxes of the year. So consumer confidence, however, has proved really resilient over the short term despite the rising concerns around the cost of living. So that's encouraging. And it was interesting that flexible working arrangements remains the primary reason West Australians are looking for new jobs, with more than 2 in 5 job seekers indicating that that's a major factor of people wanting more flexibility in the workplace. So I guess if you're a employer and you can provide that, that's really going to help with attracting workers. And one of the other key stats that came out of the Consumer Confidence Survey is over half of West Australians plan to reduce their spending on eating out over the second half of 2024. And you only have to go to cafes on the weekend. Our favourite local has had to close and not keep opening on a Sunday, which is just terrible because we love the place. We love going every Sunday, and now we can't go because they haven't got enough trade. So it's definitely affecting these more periphery areas where people can tighten up the belt and, look to save money where they can. So now, what did CCIWA find with regional business confidence in WA? It's actually slipped in both the short term and the longer term. And there's a slight decline, but it does remain higher than the level seen at the end of 2023. So just coming off of some of our high there in regional business confidence, and it's started to diverge a bit between the regional and the metro businesses, with a smaller proportion of the regional businesses optimistic about the future economic conditions. But then when I went through the actual stats, I found it interesting that over the next 3 months, 3 in 10 regional businesses expect economic conditions to soften, while 29% anticipated them to strengthen. So basically the same percentage of people expected things to soften as they did strengthen. And the remaining 2 in 5 expect conditions to remain the same. And it was very similar over the longer term. So 38% of businesses expected things to soften over the year. 22% expected conditions to improve. So slightly different over the longer term. It's nearly half of people a bit more pessimistic. And the remainder of 40% expected conditions to remain unchanged. So a little bit of softening in regional business confidence. Now, let's take a look at inflation and more particularly how it relates to WA, because I don't always touch on this and the data has just been released. So the national annual inflation rose 3.8% in June, which you may have seen hit the news. And that was up 0.2 percentage points from the 3.6 reading in March. And it marks the first annual rise in the rate of inflation since December 2022. So everyone's just taking a bit of a breath. Hopefully we're not going to see any further rise in interest rates yet, and they're just going to see what happens with this. But Perth recorded a 2.1% increase in the CPI over the quarter, bringing the inflation to 4.6% over the year. So Perth's inflation's running higher than the national inflation, and it's now the highest reading of all the capital cities. So inflation is certainly a bigger problem here in Perth than it is in the other capitals. And the main contributor to that locally has been electricity, up 44%, driven by the unwinding of the second instalment of the Energy Bill Relief Fund rebates. So they had those rebates sort of artificially making the electricity more affordable. They've stopped doing them now, and what do you know, electricity's gone up 44%. So that's pretty crazy. I guess a reason to get solar panels if you haven't already. And the next most significant contributor over the quarter were new house purchases by owner-occupiers, up 4.9%, health up 2.2%, and international holiday travel and accommodation costs up 6.2%. So that was one of the bigger ones. And in contrast, domestic holiday travel and accommodation fell. So cheaper to go for a holiday locally fell by 5.4%. Communication costs was down 0.6%. So some reductions to even out the increases. But overall, new house purchases was what's sort of driving that up. And when you think about it, that our rampant increases in housing prices has what is rolling up to affect our inflation levels for the state. Now let's go into the economic forecasts for the next 2 to 3 years, because they've just been updated. And when we look at the estimated actual figures for state final demand, it's coming in very high over the last year at 5.25%. And they're projecting for the next financial year a bit of a decrease to 3.25. What does that mean? Well, we're not going to have as much overall demand. I don't pretend to be an economics professor about what state final demand is. But let's take a look at some of the other key stats here. Unemployment rate, its actual is expected to be 3.75, and they're projecting 4% and 4.25 and 4.5 for the coming years. So expecting that unemployment to stay very reasonable, and there continue to be, plenty of jobs here. The population rate was 2.8% estimated to be the actual figures for the 23-24 financial year, which is one of the highest in the country, and they're projecting a decrease to 1.8% over 24-25, 1.7, 1.7 and 1.7 in the coming years. So they did have that over the top influx. I did a deep dive on population a few episodes back where a lot of it was sort of overhyped, because initially people that were already here converted to being residents, and it's sort of showing up in the numbers. But it's going to be still at very high levels, but more sustainable, and hopefully it'll stop putting such crazy pressure on prices. We all sort of want growth as investors, but not crazy rampant levels. We want it to be sustainable. And the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which I just mentioned, the inflation figures, they are projecting a decrease to 3% over the next 24-25 period, and then decreasing to 2.5, 2.5 and 2.5 thereafter. So all looking very positive still, with some softening on our state final demand there. But overall, employment seems to be holding up. Population seems to be increasing, projected to increase at decent levels, although not as rampant as we've had. And inflation is projected to still return to more normal levels in the band that they want to see it in. So one of the other key things I took a look at was the job vacancy numbers. And I've never actually looked at this stat. It was very interesting, going all the way back to 2008. And we've currently got 30,000 jobs advertised online, and it's near the top of what we've ever had, with 32,000 some months back. So a little bit of a decrease in jobs being advertised, but only marginal. And we contrast this with the lowest point of jobs being advertised was 13,000 back in 2016. So that was a fairly tough time in our economy, and with double what we had as far as jobs were available back then. So very decent and healthy numbers of jobs still available, and a big reason why people are moving to WA. Finally, I've looked into and done a bit of analysis on Western Australia's economy and international trade. I found it very interesting, because I haven't ever looked at these numbers before, and sort of tried to summarise them out for you. So West Australia is an export-orientated economy, as you'd probably know, and net exports of goods and services has accounted for 49% of our gross state product in 22-23. So 49%, that is pretty massive. And when we look at how we are contributing to the overall value of exports of goods in Australia, we account for 47% of the value of Australia's exports in just our state. So I tell you what, if we ever do catch a cold, the whole of Australia is going to be catching it with us, because we are the absolute powerhouse for exports in Australia. Now, where is the major trading partners? Where are they in the world? And I sort of perceive that we might have been decreasing our reliance on China. I don't have any past comparisons, but for 2023, China was still a major trading partner of goods, and we had 52.3% of our trade going to China. So that's trading goods rather going to China. So massive amount. certainly shows our reliance on, them remaining relatively strong and needing our exports. And then when we look down the list, Japan is at 10.9% compared to China's 52.3%, South Korea 5.8%, Singapore 4%, United States 3.4%, and then decreasing levels from there with Taiwan 2.6%, Malaysia 2.1%, Thailand 2.0%, India 2%. I was surprised to see India just so low on the exports that they take up at just 2% and Hong Kong 1.9%. So most of Australia's major trading partners are in Asia. 9 of WA's top 10 trading partners were there, and 8 of West Australia's top 10 import markets were from Asia as well. And our leading trading partner outside of Asia was the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany. So they were only still making up a very small portion of the overall. Now, when we look at where are our main export commodities going, just to give you a flavour of which particular exports are reliant on which particular countries, China had the vast majority of our iron ore with 85%. And then the next highest was just 6% going to Japan. So China eats up iron ore like no tomorrow. So that industry is very dependent on China still. Petroleum, one of our next biggest exports, 40% of that goes to Japan, 15% to Singapore, and 14% to China. So much less reliant on China with our petroleum exports. Looking at gold, we're a lot more sort of evenly balanced with China 28%, Hong Kong 24%, India 15%, UK 11%, Singapore 10%. Looking at lithium, China eats this up for breakfast as well, with 99% of our lithium going to China, 0.7% to Belgium. Like, it's not even worth mentioning the others, 99% going to China. We look at alumina, and this was interesting. 20% is going to Bahrain and 17% to the UAE, 11% to South Africa. So China's not taking up really any alumina. And then some of the other key exports, wheat, 24% is going to China, 19% to Indonesia, 16% to Philippines. So sort of 3 main trading partners on wheat there, with South Korea and Thailand taking up 9% each. Look at nickel, 33% going to China, 16% to Japan, 12% to South Korea. And there's a few others here, and they're not topped by China, or China's not even involved. Canola seeds, France is the main exporter, which is interesting. Gold ore, South Korea is the main exporter, and gold coins, USA was the main exporter. We mainly export to. So interesting, we're not as reliant on China in any of those things. China doesn't even appear. So bit of what I take from all of that is that we're still very reliant on China, and with the top export being iron ore, that's really our crucial point to maintain, because it accounts for the most amount of dollars of revenue with our exports, and also has the highest percentage, has China taking up the highest percentage of that. So now when we look through our international trade in services, our 2 main trade in services is for international visitors and international students and education. And the value of international education sector reached a record high last year. So it's interesting that WA is really pumping up its education again, while the state's international tourism sector returned close to its pre-pandemic levels. So not setting any new records, but we're back to where we were. And our education-related travel services exports rose 86%. So travel services related to education has really had a comeback in the economy. And when we look at where our tourists are coming from, I found this really interesting because I haven't ever looked at these stats before. United Kingdom had the biggest share of 14.2%, Singapore 11.2%, New Zealand 9.7%, China 6.9%, so not really that much, many coming from China as I might have thought. Malaysia 6.1%, United States 5.7%, Indonesia 3.9, India 3.7, Philippines 3.5, and Japan 3.5. So UK is the highest number of international visitors coming from there, with second to Singapore and then third to New Zealand. So interesting. Now, international students, I found this interesting as well. India is our main place that people come from for our international students, with 16.3% coming from there, which is big. And then we've got Bhutan, 14.2% coming from there, China, 8.8%, Pakistan, 7.1%, Philippines, 5.6%, Nepal, 4.9%, Colombia, interesting, was in there, 4.4%. So very interesting that India and Bhutan are major, places that the international students are coming from, and very reliant on those markets, keeping that sector strong. So hopefully all of that gives you some good insight into WA's economic health. It's all looking very strong still. Business confidence is softened a tiny bit, but at an all-time high, especially compared to the other states. Consumer confidence again softened a little bit because of rising house costs, but overall pretty upbeat. Inflation figures were up, mainly a result of electricity. The economic forecasts for the state are in and looking very solid. Still no crashes or anything like that on the horizon. Job vacancies are still very high, and a bit of insights there on our economy and international trade and where we're sort of reliant. So I'll be sort of really looking out for those sectors and might include some analysis of these in my quarterly market updates. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, rate and review it and share it with friends, and I look forward to catching you on the next one. See ya. Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.